Lieutenant Ethan Cross swore under his breath as the rain soaked through his uniform. The drops were acidic on this planet, the air heavy with a metallic tang that left him feeling sticky. He was posted on Navareth 4, a remote and unremarkable frontier world designated as a neutral zone between humanity and the Xyrath Empire. His orders were simple. Keep the peace, protect the outpost, and don't give the diplomats any reason to complain. Some neutral zone, Ethan muttered. The faint outline of the Xyrath delegation's camp flickered through the murk ahead, its bioluminescent dome pulsing faintly. Don't sound so grumpy. You'll scare off the neighbors. Sergeant David Morrow emerged from the shadows, his boots crunching against the slick gravel. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face that betrayed years of service in places far worse than this one. Come on. I want to check on the perimeter before we meet with our esteemed guests. Sure, Ethan said, falling into step beside him. You think they're really up for this? Sharing tech, trading resources, mingling cultures? All we've ever done is fight these guys. Yeah, but this isn't the front lines, David replied. These Xyrath folks here? They're different. They want to talk, not shoot. We just have to make sure the brass back home keeps their trigger fingers off the buttons. As they walked, Ethan glanced toward the distant ridge where the alien settlement perched. The Xyrath architecture was organic, almost plant-like, with structures that seemed to have grown from the ground rather than being constructed. He tried not to stare too long. You ever see one up close? Ethan asked. Not in armor, I mean, just as they are. Once, David said, back on Alcanar 7. The one I saw was tall, slim, almost willowy. Skin sort of shimmered like liquid metal. Their eyes, though, that's the part that gets you. Bright like polished emeralds, but calm. Real calm. It's like they see straight through you. Ethan grunted, unsure what to make of that. He had spent the past 2 years out here on the frontier without once having a direct encounter with a Xyrath, and now he was expected to protect a bunch of diplomats from both sides. Felt like he'd been thrown into the deep end without knowing how to swim. When they reached the outer fence of the human outpost, they stopped. The fence buzzed faintly as David checked the control panel. The whole area was supposed to be a peaceful neutral zone, but no one wanted to take chances. There were still plenty of rogue factions who'd happily torpedo the fragile peace effort just for the fun of it. Looks good, David said, tapping the console. No breaches, no weird signals. Guess it's just another quiet night. Let's hope it stays that way, Ethan said. He scanned the horizon. The rain was letting up, the clouds thinning enough to reveal the pale, washed-out moon that hung low in the sky. It was an eerie sight, alien yet oddly beautiful. They turned to head back toward the main outpost building. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit, the metal walls damp from the constant humidity. Ethan peeled off his soaked jacket and slung it over a chair as they reached the command center. Lieutenant Cross, Sergeant Morrow, said Captain Varn, the officer in charge. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a firm stance. Glad you're here. We've got an unscheduled meeting with the Xyrath delegation in the morning. High Command wants us to sit in as security. Understood, ma'am, Ethan said. Anything specific we should know? They'll be sending their lead diplomat, Representative Saris. Supposedly she's one of their brightest minds when it comes to interspecies relations. Keep an eye on the human delegation, too. Some of our people think this whole peace initiative is a waste of time. David smirked. Let me guess. They'd rather be shooting at Xyrath ships than sitting at a table. Exactly, Captain Varn said. That's why we need to be there. If tempers flare, we'll need to step in. Ethan nodded, though inwardly he wondered how the hell he was supposed to keep the peace when so many of his own side didn't even believe in it. As he headed back to his quarters, he glanced out the small window. The Xyrath dome still pulsed faintly in the distance. He wondered what kind of people lived there, what their leaders were like, what their hopes and fears might be. Guess we'll find out soon enough, he murmured to himself. One way or another. Chapter 2. The Truce Fractures. Ethan folded his arms as he watched the human diplomat, Ambassador Carr, gesturing wildly at the Xyrath envoy across the table. The small conference room felt stifling despite the environmental controls. On the other side of the table, the Xyrath representative, Saris, remained perfectly still, her metallic skin reflecting the pale overhead light. Her eyes, like glowing emeralds, narrowed as Car's tone rose. "I'm telling you, this kind of restriction on trade routes is completely unacceptable," Car barked, slamming a hand down on the table. "Your people agreed to fair terms. Yet here we are, blocked at every turn." Saris raised a slim hand, her voice calm but cutting. "Ambassador Carr, the agreement clearly stated that military vessels would require prior clearance to enter our borders. Your people's failure to comply with established protocols is not something we can simply overlook." Before Carr could fire back, Captain Varn stepped in. "Ambassador Representative, please," she said firmly. "This isn't helping. We need to work through this without accusations or ultimatums." Ethan stood against the wall near the room's entrance, flanked by David. Both men had been assigned as security detail for the meeting, a fact that now seemed less about preventing outside threats and more about keeping the participants from tearing each other apart. "Nice and peaceful, huh?" David muttered out of the corner of his mouth. Ethan grunted in agreement. "I've seen bar brawls that were more diplomatic than this." Carr and Saris exchanged a few more heated words before finally settling back into their seats, each clearly annoyed. Ethan caught himself watching Saris, noting how her composed demeanor never cracked. She gave no outward sign of irritation, no sharp movements or raised voice. In contrast, Carr's face was flushed, his movements exaggerated, his tone sharp and defensive. The stark difference between them felt like a microcosm of the uneasy truce they were here to maintain. Finally, the meeting adjourned. The delegates filed out of the room, leaving only the security team and Captain Varn behind. Varn sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "Well, that was productive." "Productive how?" Ethan asked. "Now they hate each other more." David shrugged. "Maybe they'll yell themselves out before tomorrow's session." Ethan gave him a skeptical look. "You really think that'll happen?" "Not a chance," David admitted with a chuckle. "But hey, one can dream." Varn shot them both a look. "Let's not encourage any more hostility. I want you two at the Xyrath side of the base tomorrow. Keep an eye on things. Make sure the delegation knows we're serious about cooperation." "Understood, ma'am," Ethan said. As they left the conference room, Ethan glanced over at David. "So what's the over-under on another shouting match tomorrow?" "I'll give it 5 minutes," David replied. "But I'll bring popcorn just in case it takes longer." The two men exchanged smirks as they walked the corridors back to the security station. The outpost was small and utilitarian, its gray walls and dim lighting doing little to brighten the mood. At the security desk, David grabbed a coffee from the machine and leaned against the console. "You ever think we're out of our depth here?" Ethan asked, taking a seat across from him. "I mean, we're just soldiers. They're expecting us to be peacekeepers, diplomats." David snorted. "I'm not here to hold hands. I'm here to keep them from killing each other. If that means playing referee, so be it." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know. It feels like we're the ones caught in the crossfire. The people up top make the rules, but we're the ones standing in the middle." David shrugged. "Welcome to the frontier, kid. You do what you can with what you've got." The next morning, Ethan and David made their way to the Xyrath side of the outpost. It was always a surreal experience entering the alien section. The air smelled different, faintly sweet and slightly charged. The walls were smooth, almost organic-looking, and the lighting was softer, a pale bluish hue that seemed more natural to Xyrath eyes. "Here we go," David said under his breath as they approached the main chamber. The Xyrath delegation stood in a half-circle, Saris at their center. Ethan and David kept their hands close to their sides, trying to appear as unthreatening as possible. Saris stepped forward, her gaze falling on Ethan. "You are the one who stood quietly during yesterday's exchange," she said. "You observed without comment." Ethan blinked. Yes, that's kinda my job." "It is a curious thing," Saris continued, her tone thoughtful. To see a human who listens rather than speaks. Tell me, Lieutenant Cross, do you find your own ambassador's approach effective? Ethan hesitated, glancing at David, who simply raised an eyebrow. I think everyone could benefit from a little more listening and a little less shouting, Ethan said carefully. On both sides. Saris studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she inclined her head slightly, a sentiment worth considering. David leaned closer to Ethan and whispered, "Looks like you just got promoted to diplomat." Ethan groaned. Just what I needed. Chapter 3. Shared Firelight. The distant sound of rushing water grew louder as Ethan trudged up the slope. Mud caked his boots, the thick jungle air clinging to him like a second skin. David walked a few paces ahead, cutting a path through the underbrush with a machete they'd managed to scavenge from the wrecked shuttle. The two of them had been separated from the main team after a rogue faction's sabotage forced a crash landing far from their intended destination. Well, it's not the vacation I had planned, David said, pausing to wipe the sweat from his brow. Yeah, I was really hoping for a beachfront resort, Ethan replied, brushing a cluster of alien ferns out of his way. Do you think the others made it? They're resourceful, David said. If they're still alive, they'll regroup at the fallback point. But we can't wait around. We have to keep moving. Ethan grunted in agreement. The two men had worked together long enough that they didn't need to say much. Ethan appreciated that. David was solid, calm under pressure, decisive when it mattered. They'd both seen their share of bad situations, but they always found a way out. Together, they were a steady pair, one making up for what the other lacked. The terrain grew steeper as they neared the source of the rushing sound. Eventually, they emerged onto a rocky ledge overlooking a wide, cascading waterfall. Below, a natural pool shimmered in the faint light filtering through the canopy. The scene was almost serene, a rare moment of beauty in an otherwise hostile environment. We should camp here for the night, David suggested. Fresh water, decent vantage point. Could be worse. Agreed. Ethan dropped his pack and stretched his aching shoulders. He looked around, scanning the trees for any signs of movement. Let's set up a perimeter just in case. I don't want any uninvited guests. As David began assembling a makeshift shelter, Ethan circled the area, marking potential entry points and noting spots where they could post watch. By the time he returned to the campsite, David had already laid out their remaining rations and built a small fire. The flames cast flickering light against the nearby rocks, and the heat was a welcome comfort in the cooling night air. Not bad, Ethan said, sitting down next to the fire. Not my first time roughing it, David replied with a smirk. Now let's figure out our next move. We're about 3 clicks from where we think the fallback point is. If we head out at first light, we can make it by mid-morning. Sounds good. What do you think we'll find when we get there? Ethan asked. David shrugged. If we're lucky, a few of the crew. If not, well, we'll figure it out. Ethan poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers dance. It's funny. We're out here, middle of nowhere, surrounded by things that probably want to kill us. And yet, this feels almost normal. You and me working the problem, taking it one step at a time. David chuckled. Guess we've been doing this job too long. Getting stranded in hostile territory just feels like Tuesday. They both laughed, the sound echoing faintly off the rocks. For a moment, the weight of their situation lifted, replaced by the simple camaraderie of two men who had been through countless challenges together. It wasn't that they ignored the danger, they were fully aware of it, but they didn't let it consume them. That was the unspoken agreement between them. No matter how bad things got, they'd keep each other steady. After finishing their meager meal, the two took turns on watch. As Ethan sat by the fire, his rifle resting across his lap, he let his mind wander. He thought about the team they'd left behind, about the uneasy truce with the Xyrath, and about the strange beauty of the world they'd crashed on. When David's turn came, Ethan lay down under the shelter and stared up at the canopy, the faint rustle of leaves lulling him into a light, restless sleep. In the morning, they set out again. The terrain grew more challenging, the jungle thicker and the underbrush more tangled. Ethan led the way this time, hacking at vines and branches, his arm growing sore from the repetitive motion. David followed close behind, keeping an eye on their six. They didn't talk much, there wasn't much to say, but they worked together seamlessly, their movements almost synchronized. As they crested a ridge, they finally spotted a clearing below. The fallback point was there, marked by a beacon that flickered weakly. The sight gave them a small surge of relief, though they knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Looks like we're still in business," David said. Ethan nodded. "Let's get down there. See who's left." Together, they made their way down, ready to face whatever came next. They knew the challenges weren't over, but for now they were still standing and still moving forward. Chapter 4. The Rescue Mission. Ethan's boots crunched over the uneven terrain as he and David pushed further into the wilderness. The alien world around them was unnervingly silent, its strange trees and twisted vines casting long, angular shadows in the pale light. The jungle wasn't thick in the traditional sense. It didn't have dense greenery so much as it had an otherworldly clutter, with clusters of coral-like growths and patches of ground that hummed faintly when disturbed. "This is starting to feel less like a rescue mission and more like a hike through hell," David muttered, wiping sweat off his forehead. Ethan glanced over his shoulder at him. "You're the one who wanted to take the shortcut." "Yeah, well, I didn't think the shortcut would involve terrain that's trying to kill me. Look at this stuff." David gestured at the ground, where a faintly glowing plant seemed to pulse as they walked past it. "I half expect it to grab me by the ankle." "Then don't stand so close to it," Ethan said, "and keep your eyes open. We're supposed to be meeting up with the team in this sector. If the Xyrath are still here, we'll have a hell of a time explaining why we're late." David snorted. "Oh, I'm sure they'll be understanding. Sorry. We got lost on the way to saving your butts. That always goes over well." Ethan sighed, slowing his pace to check the tracking beacon strapped to his wrist. "We're close. Just stay focused, all right? If anyone's still here, they're not gonna last long without backup." "Focused. Got it. I'll save my complaining for later." David readjusted his rifle and followed Ethan deeper into the strange forest. As they walked, the faint sound of a distress beacon grew louder. It was a rhythmic pulse, an electronic tone that echoed through the alien landscape. It became their guiding star, drawing them toward the clearing where the rest of the squad had reportedly set up a makeshift camp after the crash. "There," Ethan said, pointing ahead. Through a break in the coral-like trees, they could see a small cluster of figures gathered around a signal transmitter. The remnants of their team, 3 soldiers, haggard and exhausted, looked up sharply as Ethan and David stepped into view. "Lieutenant Cross, Sergeant Morrow," one of them called out, relief clear in his voice. It was Private Tarek, a lanky, sharp-eyed man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I thought you two were goners." "Not yet," David replied. "But give us a few more hours in this jungle and we'll see." Ethan stepped forward, scanning the faces of the other soldiers. Corporal Vance was there, his arm in a makeshift sling, and Specialist Renko, who had been busy reinforcing their position with whatever debris she could find. It wasn't much of a camp, just a couple of lean-tos and a single, flickering lantern, but it was something. "Where's the rest of the unit?" Ethan asked. Vance shook his head. "Split off after the crash. We're all that's left as far as I know. The others might have made it, but if they did, they're not here." Ethan nodded grimly. "Okay, here's the plan. We pack up what we can carry and head north. There's a rendezvous point where we're supposed to regroup with the main force. It's not far, but we'll have to move fast." "North," Renko frowned. "That puts us close to the Xyrath patrol zones." David grinned faintly. "Well, then we'll just have to be extra charming if we run into them." Ethan ignored the comment. "If we stick to the ravine on the way there, we'll have some cover." "Renko, how much ammo do we have left?" "Not much," she said. "A few clips each. And the comms gear isn't in great shape. The beacon's working, but that's about it." "Then we don't engage unless we absolutely have to," Ethan said. "We move quiet, stay low, and keep an eye out. Tarek, you're on point. Renko, Stick close to Vance in case his arm slows him down. David, you're with me. Let's go. The group moved out, falling into formation as they navigated through the alien forest. Despite their exhaustion, they fell into the familiar rhythm of soldiers on a mission. Ethan and David took turns scouting ahead, their movements precise and practiced. The jungle seemed alive around them, its strange flora glowing faintly as they passed. Feels like we're walking through a dream, David said quietly. More like a nightmare, Ethan replied. Keep your eyes sharp. It wasn't long before they hit their first obstacle. A deep ravine that cut through the landscape. The sides were steep and jagged, but Ethan spotted a narrow trail that sloped down and back up the other side. Think you can handle that with one arm? David asked Vance. Just try and keep up, Vance replied, gritting his teeth. They descended carefully, helping each other when needed. David kept a running commentary under his breath, muttering about the heat, the terrain, and the absurdity of their situation. Ethan found it strangely reassuring. David's complaints were constant. Sure. The area ahead. The faint glimmer of movement caught his eye. A Xyrath patrol, no more than 3 figures, moving slowly through the underbrush. They hadn't seen the humans yet. David? Ethan whispered, signaling for silence. The team froze, holding their breath as the alien soldiers passed by. Their strange, shimmering forms blending into the environment. After a tense few minutes, the patrol disappeared from view. That was close, Tarek murmured. Too close, Ethan agreed. Let's keep moving. The group pressed on, their pace steady and deliberate. They were tired, battered, and low on supplies, but they had a destination and a reason to keep going. As the rendezvous point drew nearer, the first faint hints of sunlight began to break through the canopy, casting long, slanted rays of light over the strange world they'd been forced to call home, if only for a while. Chapter 5: The Turning Point. Ethan glanced around the dimly lit room, the faint hum of the ship's engines a steady backdrop. The meeting chamber wasn't large, just a simple, circular space with walls that seemed to glow faintly from within, like the light of a distant nebula. It was far from what he was used to on human vessels, but he was beginning to adjust. Across from him, Lyra stood with her back straight, her gaze fixed on the small, floating display that illuminated the room's center. Are you certain this data is correct? Ethan asked, gesturing toward the hologram. It showed a faint trail of ionized particles, evidence of a rogue vessel that had been tailing them for days. Lyra nodded, her metallic skin reflecting the soft light. Yes, the pattern matches the one we observed earlier. It's the same craft. David leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Great, so we've got company, and not the friendly kind. Wonderful timing, too, Ethan muttered. Right as we're supposed to rendezvous with your diplomatic envoy. This changes nothing, Lyra said firmly. The envoy is still waiting for us at the designated location. If we deviate from the plan, it will only create suspicion. And if that ship decides to fire on us? Ethan countered. What then? Lyra's gaze hardened. If they intended to attack, they would have done so already. They are watching us, perhaps waiting to see if we will lead them to something valuable. David smirked. Oh, that's comforting. So we're the bait now. Enough, Ethan said, holding up a hand. Arguing won't help. We need a plan. Lyra turned back to the display, her expression thoughtful. If we arrive at the rendezvous and maintain a standard approach, we should not provoke them. I will signal my envoy to proceed with the meeting as scheduled. Any deviation will suggest we have something to hide. And if they follow us to the meeting? David asked. We're sitting ducks. Ethan considered this. Then we make sure they can't get close. We'll deploy decoys before we reach the meeting point. With any luck, they'll chase the wrong signal. Lyra inclined her head. A sound strategy. I will inform my crew. As Lyra moved to the control panel, David stepped closer to Ethan. You trust her plan? He asked under his breath. She's not giving us much of a choice, Ethan replied. And so far, she hasn't steered us wrong. David grunted. Just hope we're not the ones who end up paying the price if she is wrong. By the time they reached the rendezvous, the decoys had been launched. The rogue ship appeared to take the bait, breaking off to follow one of the false trails. Relief washed over the crew as the enemy vessel disappeared from the sensors. Ethan stood next to Lyra on the observation deck, watching as the envoy ship came into view. A sleek, silver vessel that shimmered faintly against the backdrop of space. "Looks like they took the bait," David said, joining them at the window. "For now," Ethan said. "Let's hope it stays that way." Lyra remained silent, her gaze fixed on the approaching envoy. Ethan wondered what she was thinking. Did she feel the same tension he did? The uncertainty of stepping into a room with those who might be allies or enemies. When the meeting began, Ethan and David stayed close, their presence intended to deter any hostility. The room was filled with figures from both sides, human and Xyrath alike. The air was thick with formality and unspoken tension. Ethan kept his face neutral, but his mind raced with every word exchanged. The negotiations were delicate. The Xyrath envoy was calm and measured, their metallic features betraying little emotion. The human representatives, by contrast, struggled to maintain their composure. Tempers flared occasionally, but Lyra's presence had a steadying effect. When a human diplomat raised his voice, Lyra interjected with a calm counterpoint. When a Xyrath representative grew cold and dismissive, she softened her tone, bridging the gap. Ethan watched as Lyra worked, her words carefully chosen, her posture unwavering. He had never seen someone navigate such a fraught situation with such skill. He glanced at David, who raised an eyebrow as if to say, "She's good." Ethan gave a small nod in return. The meeting stretched on, each side making small concessions, slowly inching toward common ground. By the time the session ended, the room felt lighter, as if the weight of suspicion had lifted slightly. The two groups filed out, leaving only Ethan, David, and Lyra behind. "Well," David said, "that could have gone worse." Ethan gave a small smile. "Could have gone better, too. But we're still here." Lyra turned to them, her expression thoughtful. "Your presence helped maintain order. It is appreciated." David grinned. "Don't mention it. Just doing our job." As they walked back to their quarters, Ethan found himself wondering about the next steps. The meeting had gone well enough, but the shadow of the rogue ship still loomed large in his mind. He knew the road ahead was uncertain, but for now they had taken a step forward, and that was enough. Chapter 6. Facing the Council. The hall buzzed with hushed conversations as Ethan, David, and Lyra stepped into the circular chamber. The Xyrath Council chamber was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. The walls shimmered faintly, as though they were alive, and an almost imperceptible hum filled the air. The counselors, tall, slim figures with luminous skin and eyes that seemed to see far beyond the present moment, sat in elevated seats arranged in a semicircle. Their presence was commanding without being overbearing. Ethan could feel their gaze even before he met their eyes. "Relax," David murmured beside him. "You look like you're about to be court-martialed." "Thanks," Ethan muttered. "Real helpful." Lyra led them forward, her head held high. Her posture was impeccable, her every movement purposeful. When she stopped at the center of the chamber, the murmur of conversation ceased. The council's presiding member, a Xyrath elder named Saren, leaned forward slightly, his luminous eyes settling on Lyra. "Princess Lyra," Saren said, his voice calm and resonant, "you have returned sooner than we anticipated, and with human company." "Yes, Counselor Saren," Lyra said, her voice steady. "Circumstances have changed. I come seeking the council's wisdom and, perhaps, its intervention." Saren's eyes flicked to Ethan and David, lingering for a moment before returning to Lyra. "You travel in unusual company, Princess. What is it you ask of us?" Lyra took a step forward. "The rogue faction that attacked our delegation continues to threaten the peace. They do not speak for us, nor do they act with the council's blessing. But their actions have strained the tenuous trust between our people and the humans. I request the council's support in openly condemning their actions and working with the human representatives to strengthen our alliance." A murmur ran through the chamber. Saren's expression did not change, but his tone grew more deliberate. Strengthen the alliance? Such a proposal is not without risk. Many among our people already view these overtures with suspicion. To take such a stance may further divide us. David shifted slightly, leaning closer to Ethan. This guy knows how to make a simple request sound like a galactic disaster. Ethan resisted the urge to nudge him. Just let her handle it, he whispered back. Lyra stood her ground. I understand the risks, counselor, but the alternative is far worse. If we do nothing, we allow these radicals to dictate the narrative. We must show the humans that we stand with them against those who would perpetuate conflict. Saren regarded her silently for a moment before turning his gaze to Ethan. Lieutenant Ethan Cross, is it? Ethan straightened. Yes, counselor. You have been witness to these events. Tell us, what is your assessment? Does this alliance hold any true promise? Or are we chasing illusions? The room's attention shifted to Ethan. He glanced at Lyra, who gave him a subtle nod, then turned back to the council. I don't claim to be an expert in diplomacy, Ethan began, choosing his words carefully. I'm a soldier. I follow orders. But I've seen what happens when mistrust leads to war. I've seen how quickly things fall apart when both sides assume the worst. In the time I've spent working with Princess Lyra and her people, I've learned that they're not so different from us. They want stability, security, and a future free from constant conflict. If we can find a way to trust each other even a little, it's worth the effort. Otherwise, we're just waiting for the next fight to start. Saren studied him, his glowing eyes searching for something. After a moment, he leaned back in his seat. Your honesty is noted, Lieutenant. We will take your words into consideration. Ethan exhaled silently. He hadn't been sure how that would go over, but at least they hadn't dismissed him outright. Saren turned to Lyra. Princess, we will deliberate on this matter. You and your human companions are dismissed for now. Lyra inclined her head. Thank you, counselor. As they left the chamber, Ethan could feel the tension in his shoulders easing. David walked beside him, hands stuffed into his pockets. Not bad, David said quietly. I think you almost impressed them. Almost? Ethan muttered. Let's just hope they decide to act before it's too late. Lyra turned to them as they exited the chamber. You spoke well, Lieutenant. Thanks, Ethan said. You weren't too bad yourself. A small, almost imperceptible smile crossed her lips. Let us hope the council sees reason. We cannot afford to wait much longer. They made their way back to the waiting area, each of them acutely aware that the council's decision could shape the future of their fragile alliance. For now, all they could do was wait. Chapter 7. A Leap of Faith. Ethan and David stood just inside the entrance to the sprawling diplomatic hall. The gathering space was nothing like the Xyrath council chamber they had seen earlier. This was a neutral ground, human-built but furnished to accommodate both sides. The walls were smooth metal, reflecting the pale, dim light of overhead panels. A long, curving table dominated the center, flanked by tall chairs designed to fit the alien frame of the Xyrath, as well as the more solid build of humans. Representatives from both species were beginning to gather, speaking in low voices as they took their places. The atmosphere was tense, but there was no outright hostility. Not yet, anyway. Ethan watched as Lyra entered, her movements graceful, her expression unreadable. She took her seat at the table, glancing briefly at Ethan as if to draw strength from his presence. You sure this is going to work? David asked, keeping his voice low. No, Ethan replied honestly. But we don't have much of a choice. Great. That's reassuring. Before Ethan could respond, a sharp tone signaled the start of the proceedings. Captain Varn, seated at the human end of the table, called the room to order. Thank you all for coming, she began. Today's meeting is an important step forward. We are here to finalize the terms of the joint settlement on Navrith 4 and to address the recent disruptions caused by rogue factions on both sides. Ethan stayed back with David, standing along the wall as the discussions began. The humans and Xyrath spoke carefully at first, choosing their words as though testing the waters. It didn't take long, however, for the underlying tensions to surface. A human ambassador questioned the Xyritha's commitment to transparency, and a Xyrith diplomat countered by citing the recent unauthorized border crossings by human vessels. Voices rose, and the room grew warmer as the arguments escalated. Lyra intervened, her voice steady but firm. If we continue to dwell on past grievances, we will accomplish nothing. Let us focus on what we can do moving forward. A Xyrith counselor, seated near the center of the table, inclined his head slightly. Your words are wise, Princess, but trust is earned, not granted. How do you propose we move forward without repeating the mistakes that brought us here? Lyra's gaze moved across the table. Trust must begin with mutual understanding. Both sides must be willing to listen, to compromise. We cannot expect perfection overnight, but we can take the first steps. A shared settlement is not only a gesture of goodwill, it is a foundation for something greater. If we fail here, we lose the opportunity to build that foundation. The room quieted. Even the human ambassadors, who had been fidgeting moments before, seemed to pause and consider her words. Ethan found himself admiring her composure. She spoke with a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the noise, drawing attention without demanding it. David leaned over to whisper, "She's good at this. Better than the rest of them. She's got a way of keeping people in line without making it feel forced," Ethan replied. "I think that's why they listen to her." As the discussion continued, Lyra's calm demeanor helped keep the room from boiling over. Ethan watched as she steered the conversation back on track time and time again. When the human ambassador raised another concern about resource allocation, Lyra suggested a rotating oversight committee composed of representatives from both sides. When a Xyrith counselor questioned the timeline for the settlement's construction, Lyra proposed a phased approach, allowing for adjustments along the way. Each time a new issue arose, she offered a solution, imperfect, perhaps, but workable. Hours passed, and the room slowly began to feel less charged. The voices that had been sharp and accusatory softened into something resembling genuine dialogue. By the time Captain Varn signaled the end of the session, both sides had made concessions. The joint settlement plan was approved, albeit with some conditions, and a tentative schedule for its development was set. As the diplomats filed out, Lyra approached Ethan and David. She looked tired but composed. "Thank you for being here," she said quietly. "We didn't do much," Ethan replied. "You're the one who kept them from tearing each other apart." Lyra's expression softened, just slightly. "Perhaps, but having you here reminds them that this is about more than just politics. It's about the people, the ones who will live in that settlement. Your presence helps keep that in perspective." David crossed his arms and grinned. "So what you're saying is, we're the stars of the show." Lyra arched a delicate eyebrow. "If that's how you choose to see it, Sergeant Morrow, who am I to argue?" Ethan chuckled. "Well, if you keep this up, maybe they'll start listening to each other for real." "That is my hope," Lyra said, her voice softer now. "One step at a time, Lieutenant." As they exited the hall, the distant stars visible through the station's windows seemed just a little brighter. The work was far from finished, but for the first time, it felt as though real progress had been made. Chapter 8. The Hope They Brought. The atmosphere in the settlement's central plaza was charged, but this time it wasn't with tension. Instead, the air felt lighter, as if a collective breath had finally been released. Humans and Xyrith moved among one another, hesitant at first but gradually more relaxed. The plaza itself, once a barren expanse of neutral ground, now showed signs of life. Tall structures of glass and sleek metal rose alongside the Xyritha's organic, flowing architecture, a blend of two distinct aesthetics that somehow fit together. Ethan stood near one of the new community towers, leaning on a metal railing as he scanned the growing crowd. David joined him, carrying 2 steaming cups of something that passed for coffee on this world. He handed one to Ethan and took a sip of his own. "Hard to believe, huh?" David said, gesturing at the scene before them. "They're actually getting along." "Mostly," Ethan replied, eyeing a pair of human workers haggling over construction materials with a Xyrith foreman. Still a few bumps here and there. Sure, but no one's pointing guns at each other. I'd call that a win. David took another sip, grimacing slightly. Although I'm not sure about the local brew. Ethan smirked. You can't get good coffee out here. You know that. Doesn't mean I won't keep hoping, David said with a shrug. So what's next? We just stick around and play peacekeepers. Something like that, Ethan said. At least until this place can run itself. David nodded toward the other end of the plaza. There she is, Princess Diplomatic, making her rounds. Ethan followed his gaze and spotted Lyra walking among the settlers. She moved with the same steady grace she always had, her metallic skin catching the sunlight. Wherever she went, people seemed to stop and listen. Even the human construction crew, who were notorious for brushing off orders, paused and paid attention when she spoke. You should probably go talk to her, David said casually, leaning back against the railing. Why? Ethan asked, giving him a sideways glance. David grinned. Because she's looking this way. Ethan turned back toward the plaza and found that Lyra had indeed noticed him. She raised a hand in a small wave before excusing herself from the group she was speaking with and walking toward him. Ethan felt a brief flicker of nerves but pushed it aside. Lieutenant Cross, she said, her voice calm and even as always. You've been avoiding me. I wouldn't say that, Ethan replied. Just keeping busy. Busy doing what, exactly? Lyra asked, a faint smile playing on her lips. Standing by the railing? Ethan chuckled. Guilty as charged. David coughed into his hand. I think I'll let you two talk. I need to check on the supply run. He gave Ethan a knowing look before walking away, leaving them alone. Lyra tilted her head slightly, studying him. You've been very quiet since we arrived. Is something troubling you? Not really, Ethan said. I'm just not used to all this peace. After everything that happened, I figured it'd be a lot harder to get to this point. It was hard, Lyra said. It still is. But the fact that we're here, together, speaks volumes. Ethan nodded. Yeah, I guess it does. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as humans and Xyrith worked side by side to unload supplies and set up new structures. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, still moments of tension. But it was a start. You know, Lyra said softly, I never imagined this would be possible. When we first met, I saw you. And now. Ethan hesitated, then gave a small smile. Now I think we've come a long way. Lyra's expression softened, and she reached out, resting a hand lightly on his arm. The touch was brief but spoke volumes. We've done something few thought possible, Ethan. I hope you see that. I do, he said. And I know it's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do. Yes, she agreed. But it's work worth doing. They stood together, watching the settlement come to life. In that moment, it didn't matter that they came from different worlds, that their species had once been enemies. All that mattered was the future they were building, together.